Hello and welcome to Arves of Harbour. It is now October, so we're doing the books of September. It's been interesting so far this month, so to be honest, recently I've been on a bit of a reading slump. Like, I've been reading, but I've not been engaging or enjoying with it as much as before. I've been reading a little bit slower as well, but September did kind of change that. I did come across some books that I really did enjoy in September, so I'm very glad and happy to begin Wow. Okay, so that's my books of September. 5 and 1, very big one on the top, but let's get started. Book number 1 is Those Who Leave and Those Who Stay, which is the third book of the Neapolitan novels, following from the story of the new name. Now, in this book, it follows immediately after the events of the story of a new name, where we still have our narrators, or still have a narrator, Elena, and her friend, Lena. Except now they're a bit older and they're kind of set in their ways of who they are. Elena is now quite established as a writer. Her novel's been published and is doing the rounds, right? It's showing up on newspapers, and she's doing interviews, and she's kind of trying to make it as an author. And at the same time, her friend Lena she's run away from the neighborhood. She has stayed with one of the most stable men of the neighborhood, Enzo, and together she's working at a sausage factory for a young entrepreneur who is kind of taking advantage of her. Meanwhile, Enzo is currently studying technology and wants to work with computers. And so things seem to be at a head in this book, where things are starting to settle down, but as turbulent as the last 2 books were, this one kind of continues that. So we get a lot of drama happening. We have a lot of characters from the original neighborhood returning, and so we see a lot of the patterns that occurred with childhood reoccurring here. Actually, what I find really fascinating about this book is that now the characters are adults and are having children of their own and are having to make decisions for themselves. We see a lot of them repeating the patterns of their parents and their family, whether it is by just unintentionally starting to co-opt habits like the narrator does, or whether it's through trying to deliberately reject aspects of their parentage like Nino. Regardless of this, their reaction to their upbringing and their very kind of dramatic moments of their childhood define who they are and railroad them into the kinds of conflicts they experience here. So I've always found the series to be tremendously emotional. When I was reading The Story of a New Name, I just emotionally distraught the entire time. I was feeling the same things characters were feeling. I would genuinely be going through my normal day and be feeling happy or sad because of what was happening in the book as I was reading it. And this is continued for Those Who Leave and Those Who Stay. There is kind of an extent to which I don't have as much patience for these people anymore, because I think once someone becomes an adult and once someone starts to make those commitments they can't get out of, once it becomes clear who a person is, I think it's very tempting, just as a human being, to make that assumption that they'll never change anymore, and it's hard to invest in seeing them improve or resolve a conflict or get out of a pattern of behavior that leads them into strife. Like, there's really only so much patience that you can afford somebody until it becomes bleak, until you kind of give up. And so I was really challenged by that in this book, knowing that there's going to be a fourth and knowing that these characters are going to get their resolution, and also knowing from the very beginning what happens to Lena is that she's eventually going to disappear. That running mystery keeps me going in those moments where I'm going to be honest, I wanted to stop reading because the characters are just so much themselves. The problems are just so consistent to them, to the point that they don't surprise me as much this time when they happen. When Lena decides to... I'm trying to be really vague here because this is the third book in the series. I'm going to spoil everything from book 1 and book 2. When Lena decides to take her career a certain direction, or when Elena has a certain gripe with her family, or with Lena, or with people from the past that come back to visit, it's just kind of more fatalistic this time than before, because we're not really learning new things about the characters anymore. We're just seeing them play out the consequences of being who they are and being surrounded by the people around them. And so while there's still important, big, exciting, emotional, triumphant moments, these aren't marked so much by, this is the first time this character is doing this. Instead, they're marked by the fact that this is a character who's been consistent and can't change, and they're just adapting or even just surviving in whatever kind of environments that fate's just thrown them into. And so my relationship with this book is a little bit different to the previous ones, but I did still enjoy it. I am still very excited to read the last one and to finish it and to see what direction it goes. I still did get very emotional various times reading this. I would give it maybe a 4 out of 5. I think I loved the story of A New Name. I thought that really captured the drama of transitioning between being a teenager and being an adult. Whereas this book, I think the transition between being a young adult and being a mature adult is marked by more ups and downs in a way that didn't compel me quite as much, but I can still recognize the skill is there, and it's still an incredible novel. Like, I still have a wonderful time reading it, and it still made me think just tremendously about my personality and my relationship with others, how complex the interior lives of everyone that I come across are, and I'm excited to finish it. So that's those who leave and those who stay. Book number 2, this is my short story collection, Winesburg, Ohio by Sherwood. I did not know a single thing about this getting into it, other than it's a very well-respected series of American short stories, and it's set in Ohio. I didn't know that Winesburg is not a real town. It's a fictionalized location that's based around the author's hometown where he grew up. But otherwise, it's very ordinary, very straightforward, regional American stories, but in a surprisingly intimate and salacious way. Like, this book is pretty old. This book, I want to say, was from the 30s or even older than that. This book is from 1919, but it is often about the kind of sordid interior lives of its characters, to the point where it really doesn't seem afraid of being criticized for, at the time, obscenity. And even now, like, to me, I read some of the stories and I go, whoa, you know, like that kind of feeling where you go, I think I'm finding out more about this person than I'm supposed to. Like, it goes beyond standard conversation. It goes really deep into people's fantasies and desires and lusts, and that at times is very funny. And some of these stories really did get me chuckling, because it did seem to speak so candidly about things that we would otherwise hide away. And especially in that kind of small town setting, everyone starts to know what everyone else is like, or everyone has their own assumptions or judgments about everybody else, and we see these characters kind of grapple with the interiority that they have. And maybe for this historical period, when things like sex and romantic desire and religious doubts and all of these things are kind of held inside and kept down, then having a book of stories like this, where they do get to be spoken out and expressed, is interesting and fascinating and freeing and weirdly perverse in a way that we just don't really have today, because our culture is just freer, it's just more open. We speak about things more, there are less taboo subjects. We don't really get books like this where we feel both the constraint of not wanting to say something contrasted against just how powerful an interior thought or desire can be. So I found it interesting, and I'm pretty sure that Sherwood Anderson was quite young when he wrote this. He was not. He was 24 plus 19, quick maths, 45. That's not very young, but he is writing about people still much older than him, and he's still trying to, I guess, write in a voice that seems like he knows what the world is like through someone else's eyes. And that to me is always something very, very ambitious, not always successful, and it can make or break a writer's style, because if I read something and I think to myself, this is not a 70-year-old man, or this is not a 15-year-old child, this is a 45-year-old person pretending to be either of those things, then that can ruin the feeling for me a little bit. And that did happen here sometimes, especially in those stories where it felt like the point was more to make a political or a social or a cultural statement rather than just trying to render a person exactly as they were. And so it's a bit of a mixed bag. These stories are so varied. Some of them are very short, some of them are very long. Some don't really have anything happening in them. Some are just kind of character sketches. Others are whole spans of a character's life. So you really don't know what you're getting into. But I did enjoy it, and they're skillful. It's one of those books that actually helps me understand what modernism as a literary movement means, because that kind of character interiority where we get people's thoughts and beliefs and wishes and desires, when we see their psychologies in a way that kind of lets us dig around in a person and try to figure out what makes them tick, that to me is very, very modernist, much more so than anything from the century before or anything that coming from the postmodern era, where we can't know what's truly inside anybody. This kind of method of trying to make a grand statement about life and about humanity really rings true to this era. And I found it fairly accessible. I found it fairly enjoyable. I don't know if I'll remember it much afterwards, to be honest. There are a couple of stories that stand out in my mind, but I think over time they'll sort of fade out as well, so I will give it a 3 out of 5. Book number 3 that made me laugh is Paddy, Clarke, Ha 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 by Roddy Doyle. The laughter is in the name, so it should make you laugh, right? It was fine. So it won the Booker in 1993, and it is about a young boy growing up in Ireland in around the 1960s. He has a younger brother who everyone calls Sinbad, even though that's not his real name. His real name is Francis, and nothing really happens. It's one of those books where those kinds of childlike anecdotes of growing up are just told to the audience. And then as that happens, one thing that I do really like about this book is that it understands the flow of time really well. So we see, I think, around a decade of our narrative's growth and development. And as that happens, that's coincided with the social and economic change of the town of Ireland that they live in. We see the demographics change, we see the buildings change, we see even the cultural things change a little bit through the eyes of the narrator, who doesn't fully understand it, but is just trying to notice things the way that a young child would notice things. I thought that the young voice was quite believable, and I did find that towards the end there were some nice emotional payoff moments where, now that the narrator is getting older and he's taking responsibility for himself, he starts to see how to treat other people with kindness and how to recognize the complexity in all people. And that's eventually good. But largely this book is just toilet humor and just the kind of jokes that you would imagine a teenager to be making. And I don't personally need a reminder of that, especially when I don't think that my childhood was very similar to this, and I don't think there's really much universality to be said about growing up like this. I think that this book works more strongly when it points towards one specific person's experience of this specific country, town, time period, all of that in that sense. Whereas to read this book as a universal rendition of childhood and growing up, I think it falls a little bit flat, because things have changed and times have changed, and it's hard to write about childhood universally, especially when so much has changed in the last couple of decades. So I don't know why you would really ever go back to this. I think as someone who's trying to read through all the Booker winners, I was guided to this, but it's had its moment, and its moment has passed, and its jokes aren't funny in the same way that they must have been when it came out. If you ever really want to know what literature in the 90s was like and how they saw the 60s and how childhood was viewed then maybe this is meaningful to you, but this is not really my starting point. I didn't find it as funny as I would have liked. There are some moments that I liked, but that's few and far between in a novel that ultimately didn't grab me and I didn't relate to, so I'll give this a 2 out of 5. Book number 4. Now, speaking of books that relate to me, The Namesake by Jhumpa Lahiri is about a migrant child growing up in America. Their family has migrated from Calcutta, and this child is given the name Gogol after the famous Russian author Nikolai Gogol, after his father had a near-death incident on a train and the one thing that he saved was a copy of the short story The Overcoat by Nikolai Gogol. And so he names his son after this. That's why the book's called The Namesake. And the son grows up in America, first in Connecticut and then in New York, and goes through the standard migrant child's upbringing, right? Like somewhat middle-classy, education-focused teenage years, and then experimentation through university, high expectations, and then falling in love, starting relationships, engaging with questions of culture, like how much they want to connect with American culture, or more broadly speaking, a white American culture, and how much they want to retain elements of their Indian culture. It's a story that's familiar, and one that, to me, I feel like is aimed more towards a Western audience than it is towards a migrant audience. But gosh, I really liked this book. I thought that it was just a delightfully well-told story. The actual plot is really simple. There's not too much to say about it. The only interesting thing I think I can mention about the plot, without giving anything away, is that it doesn't feel railroaded. There are events in the middle and towards the end where the timing is very inconvenient from a narrative standpoint. Like, this thing would not happen at this time if I was trying to tell the most cohesive or emotional or compelling story. But that just means that the characters and the moments don't feel like they're being used as tools to further a story. Instead, we're just seeing a person and events happening to them and them having to react to the things that happen to them. So to me, that added to the realism. And then the writing style is just really, really gorgeous. It's been a long time since I've read a work where I actually want to slow down and pay attention to the sentences and just how ornate and crafted these sentences are. And I find that not a lot of authors nowadays write in the similar style, where there's a marked poetry to the prose, where even describing something like walking down the streets or tidying up a bedroom, where those ordinary moments are given this extra sense of lavishness. I feel like most books that come out recently tend to be faster, and that has its own benefits and drawbacks. But something like The Namesake is a book where ordinary, like very, very ordinary things could be happening, but I can still read it and be entranced because the actual word-to-word, sentence quality of the book is just so amazing. And I wonder if I like it a lot just because of how similar it is to me. Like, if you know me in real life, tell me if this sounds familiar. A person from a migrant background is named something completely bizarre by English and American or Australian standards, and has to grow up thinking about what their name means and the history of their name, while also engaging with how much they want to engage with their home culture, and then eventually later in life deciding to change or anglicize that name to control their own identity, and has to deal with the ramifications of doing that. Isn't that funny, right? And I'm not saying that every book has to be exactly like you or the person reading. And I don't mean to say that people should only seek out books that reflect their own experience. And usually I wouldn't like a book that felt just like my experience. In fact, maybe one of the reasons why I like this one more is because it's about an Indian or Bengali experience rather than a Chinese one. But I could still connect really well with the characters. In a way, it's kind of like a fantasy, like a migrant upbringing fantasy, because the title character gets to enjoy all the things that you enjoy when you're a migrant child. You get to make the same decisions, but also delight in both your home culture and the new culture you're integrating into. It felt very cozy, it felt very safe. Even as dramatic things happened, I never felt stressed, I never felt really tested. In fact, I could just enjoy my time with these characters, and I liked it. So I would give it a 5 out of 5. I really would. I also very much liked Interpreted Maladies, but that book was, to me, more about gut punches. Like, it was short stories that wanted to have really big emotional moments, whereas The Namesake is just a pleasant time. And it's interesting because when I finished reading this, I looked at a few different reviews, saw people who liked it, saw people who didn't, and it really is a book that rides the wave of the multicultural narrative boom of the 2000s. It fits into that, but I like it. I don't know. That's all I can say. I like it. Okay, and this last one I'm going to be talking about for a very long time. So, A Brief History of Seven Killings is a novel that won the Booker Prize in 2015. It is a gigantic work, and it is completely filled with just a lot of things. It's filled with history, it's filled with drama and thrilling moments and crime. It tells the story of the assassination attempt against Bob Marley in the, I want to say 1960s, 1970s, 1976, it's on the back. So, on the night before a peace concert that Bob Marley was performing in Jamaica, a bunch of armed gunmen stormed the house and tried to shoot him. But he survives his attempt and then goes on to perform this concert where two political leaders from rival political parties reconcile on stage and have a moment of shared peace. And this is a novel which builds upon that historical moment to try and reflect what Jamaica was like in the 1970s and 80s and how all of this comes together. Like, it's very, very dense and detailed. The first thing that you're hit with when you look at this book is the character list, which is 4 pages long, and they span different cities. There's things that happen in Kingston, and things that happen in Montego Bay, things that happen in Miami and New York. It just goes everywhere, and there are so many different characters from so many different factions, and many of them then become narrators in the story. It's just very, very complicated, and the Jamaican characters tend to speak in dialect, and it's very accented English, and there are other characters from the CIA. There's just factions upon factions, and it's just very in your face too. It's very fast-paced, chapters are very short, often quite violent and dramatic, often quite shocking and brutal, unrelentingly so, to the point where sometimes I'd be reading on the train, I had to stop for a bit, just look around and make sure that everything was still alright. It's intense, and it's just a lot. It's just a lot. So the wider premise going off that assassination attempt is that in Kingston at the time the story is set, there are two political parties where the leaders are also leaders of, I guess, two slums or two districts of Kingston, and both are known for just poor conditions, high poverty rates, and high crime, very disadvantaged due to various economic forces that affected Jamaica at the time. And so violence, and especially gun violence, was common between these two factions to a high extent, and Bob Marley appears as this almost mythical figure. So all the characters in this book are named except for Bob Marley. He's always referred to as the singer. He's kind of this uncontrollable chess piece that all the other characters are dancing around, because he's a figure that has suddenly put Jamaica on the international stage. He's a figure that is connected to America and is connected to international wealth. And so people are debating over how to run the country politically, whether they're leaning more towards a communist structure and creating stronger ties with Cuba, or whether they're leaning more towards a capitalist structure and taking cues from America. Now, America at the time was still during the Cold War and very deeply was suspicious of communism. So what they had done was go to Jamaica and just supply weapons to various factions and just destabilize the country. It's a very kind of CIA inside job type of narrative. And while this is all going on, we have two more plot lines. We have a journalist named, I want to say his name's Alex Pierce, but that's such an ordinary name. Is his name actually Alex Pierce? Yeah. We have a journalist named Alex Pierce who works for Rolling Stone, and he's trying to write the story of Bob Marley and connect it to the story of Jamaica, and he ends up becoming very fascinated with this assassination attempt. And then we also have the story of Nina Burgess Williams, who's a young woman growing up in Jamaica who wants to leave, and she's doing whatever it takes to lift us up out of poverty in a way that gives herself agency, but is, in a sense, like taking advantage of the globalization happening to Jamaica, and doing this in a way which is still quite limited by patriarchal forces in the country. And so we have those three threads, each of which is probably enough for its own novel, and then two-thirds of the way through, we then jump to America, where a lot of characters have now migrated to New York and to Miami, and are controlling various organized crime groups there. And so all of this aligns with real historical figures and real historical people, but it's hard to know exactly how accurate or correct it is. Like, Marlon James has done a tremendous amount of research, and that shows through all of the interviews that we see about this book, all of the conversations that occur within the book and about the book. That's something that I have no real doubt of. Although, because it is fictionalized, I'm still a bit wary of treating this as a historical document, but it is just such a powerful dramatization of the history and the people involved. Like, we get sections that are narrated by the individual enforcers of the organized crime groups. We see how they come from their own disadvantaged backgrounds, and we see just how traumatic their past can be, what turns a person into someone who can kill indiscriminately, and how their minds work when they're affected by various substances as well. It turns into poetry. It turns into really, really compelling passages that speak to the things that happen when we're motivated by anger or fear or just a desire for pain to go away. When those things take hold, we understand why there is so much violence in these kinds of environments. We understand why people can do this to somebody else. Like, it's not a case of some people just being evil, but rather the societal forces that bring this about are the ones that are at fault. And so the novel's not kind to America at all. The novel's very critical of the kind of CIA machinations that were happening in Jamaica at the time. It doesn't have a lot of characters directly from the CIA, but the ones that are present do present their work in a very shady way towards the audience. So we don't have so much sympathy for them, but at the same time, we have a very difficult time sympathizing with a lot of the Jamaican political leaders, because of the more direct crimes that we see them committing as well. So we see everyone for their power and their damage, what they do and what is done to them. All of that kind of bounces around in all these perspectives, and it makes for a very compelling but very difficult reading experience. I read this quite slowly, so although it's really big, it took me longer than I normally would have. I think it took me 15 or so days to finish this. Part of it was because I was trying to Google things and make sure that I was understanding it. It is sometimes hard to understand just because of the way that information is conveyed. It's very non-linear. Sometimes people talk around the subjects that they actually mean. There's talking in codes, there's code switching, there's a lot of different things going on, and it is easy to miss significant plot points. I feel like I kind of ruined my experience reading this because I did Google something that revealed something about a character, and once I got to the point where the character reveals that information about themselves, I feel like I wasn't supposed to know that until it happened. I'm being so vague here, but I think that the surprise was a really important part of that, and me not having that meant I didn't react as emotionally to that part of the narrative. And that meant, for me, about a third of the novel just didn't do as much as I would have wanted it to. And it meant the emotional punch towards the end was not as strong as it could have been. And ultimately, I see this as a novel where I can respect it on an intellectual perspective a little bit more than I was enchanted by it or entranced by it. Although I had a really incredible reading experience and I got a lot out of it, I find that it is difficult, and I might not be the type of reader that would get the most out of it. That being said, I do really respect it, and I think that it's, for all the work that was involved in putting it together, and just how wildly ambitious it is very deserving of winning something like the Booker Prize. And in fact, when I started reading Booker Prize winners this year, I thought that most of them were going to be like this. Like, even if I didn't like them, I would at the very least respect them for how ambitious they were. I wouldn't be getting things like Paddy, Clarke, ha ha ha. I would be getting more of these things that kind of pushed what was possible fiction and made me see the world in ways that I had never seen it before. So I have a lot of warnings for people who do want to get into this book. It is a very fascinating look at Jamaican history, but it is genuinely quite brutal, and it doesn't make it easy to get your way through. There are so many characters, a lot of them speak very differently, there are a lot of factions, a lot of motivations, and it spans decades of history and requires a lot of knowledge about cultural things as well. So yeah, it's not easy, but it is tremendously rewarding. I would give it a 4 out of 5, mostly based on my engagement and enjoyment with it. But I think it is a fantastic book, and there is definitely going to be people out there who absolutely love it. Alright, and that's my 5 books of September. I have spent the rest of this month slowly trudging my way through Ulysses, and I am more than 2/3 of the way through, so I will be finishing that hopefully in October, hopefully having a video out to just explain what I got out of it. But it has been also quite difficult. I have planned out what my topics are going to be for next year, and I'm excited to be reading things that I want to be reading. I don't know if I want to be doing so many challenges and awards and just literary fiction anymore. I think it's been a while since I've read just for pure enjoyment, and maybe I would like to do more of that. So if there are any things to recommend that are very enjoyable or very entertaining, I would probably want to go more in that direction in the coming months and coming years. So we'll see how that goes. Otherwise, thanks everyone for joining, and I will see you sometime.